Well, first of all, let me say that it's a great privilege to be able to address the conference. I wish I could have attended it. I think the work that the Centre for Economic and Social Rights is doing on human rights and tax policy is of absolutely critical importance. And I think that the various partner organisations that have come together in Lima to discuss these issues are to be congratulated for being at the forefront of one of the most pressing issues on the human rights agenda today. The starting point is to acknowledge that tax policy is actually human rights policy. We've spent a lot of time over the years in the human rights area talking about national action plans, talking about white papers, talking about human rights policies, etc. Most of those don't come to fruition. They don't happen. They're good ideas, but they remain in the realm of theory. Tax policy, on the other hand, and national budgets are completely different. They actually happen. They reflect the real priorities of the government, not those that are put down for human rights purposes. So the focus on tax policy is actually at the heart of the government decision-making process and tells you what its real priorities, its real concerns are. In the human rights area, one of the key issues is resource availability. That applies, of course, to economic and social rights. If you don't have money, you can't afford food and health and education. It applies equally, though, to civil and political rights. If you don't have money, you don't have effective policing, you don't have decent court systems, and so on. That money may come, if we're lucky, from some sort of overseas development assistance, but that's dwindling, and generally it's unreliable, and for many countries it barely exists. The reality then is that domestic resource mobilization is the key, and that comes about through tackling the large economic issues, including illicit financial flows overseas, including corruption, but particularly the focus on taxation, ensuring that taxes are imposed domestically, that they are collected, and of course that they are arranged in such a way that they are designed to bring about respect for human rights. Human rights as a tax issue is something that the human rights movement has been very slow to address. There are lots of reasons for that. First of all, too many human rights experts are qualified in the law and not in other matters. They tend to shy away from issues of economics and particularly taxation. More importantly, there's a general assumption on the part of many human rights groups that issues of redistribution are off the table as far as they are concerned. They content themselves with the financial, fiscal, economic status quo and try to move things around within those limits. That's a grave mistake because, as I said earlier, tax policy is where it's at. If you have an inequitable tax policy, if you have a government that is simply not collecting taxes from the elites, which happens so often, if you have a government who is giving enormous subsidies to the wealthy and no social transfers to the poor, then it's a human rights issue. But that has generally not been recognized. There's of course also the delusion that when we're dealing with civil and political rights, the obligations of all governments are there regardless of resources. That's simply not the case. So even if our focus was only on trying to ensure that civil and political rights are respected, budgets, taxation become central issues. The big question that needs to be answered, of course, is what the human rights movement can bring to all the work that's already being done by tax experts, by those who have long been working in the areas of resource transparency, fiscal efficiency, and so on. It's not an easy question to answer, and it's not one that most tax experts actually understand. But the difference is that suddenly tax policy becomes not just a matter of cold economic policy of trying to move around resources. It becomes a much more vital living concern aimed at ensuring respect for the human rights of all of the citizens and others living in a given country. So it can transform the way in which tax policy making is made if human rights considerations are brought into the heart of it. It's not just a question of technical goals and techniques to try to achieve the maximum amount of fiscal revenue. It's a matter of what the objectives are and how that money is going to be spent. Going forward, I think there are many opportunities for the human rights movement to start to work much more closely in the way that this conference is precisely designed to do with the various groups that have the expertise that the human rights proponents don't. It's clear that international structures are very important. If I or someone like me says to the UN Human Rights Council they ought to be looking at tax matters, the response, which I don't accept but I understand, is why should we be doing tax matters? That belongs elsewhere. Well, the answer to that question is, okay, so where? And the initial response is going to be the OECD in Paris. The OECD in Paris is rightly known as the Rich Countries Club. It does very good work on a range of tax issues, but it does not amount to a fully international forum to discuss this vital range of issues. For the UN part of it, there is an international committee of experts on cooperation, and it too has done some useful work, but it doesn't amount to the sort of sustained political and technical focus on tax policy, international cooperation, and so on that is needed. So going forward, I think we need to work towards, first of all, as Oxfam and others have suggested, some sort of international summit on tax policy, but we also have to work towards the establishment of a specialist body within the UN to focus on tax matters. We need to put an end to the fiscal evasion, the tax evasion that is rampant, particularly in Europe. We need to make sure that the resources that rightly should be flowing through taxation to developing countries do that instead of being diverted through countries like Singapore and Ireland and the various Caribbean hideouts for this money. The big challenge, I think, though, is to make sure that the two groups understand one another's agendas and work out constructive ways to work together. At present, the bottom line is that most human rights specialists don't appreciate the centrality of tax, and the vast majority of tax specialists have very little idea of how human rights is relevant. This conference is a fantastic beginning to really bringing these two constituencies together and moving forward in a much more constructive way. Thank you.